Steven, thank you. Thank you so much for this brilliant and encompassing presentation. I think you covered the whole ground and touched all the sore points. And I wish you were less knowledgeable about Brazil, because in that case, your picture of the country wouldn't be so accurate. You know,
I have a very
clearly
good Brazilian research assistant.
Yeah, you tend to agree. And after listening to your talk, I would say that the only thing which is better than listen to your talk is to read your book. I really recommend everybody here to read his book. By the way, it
in
will
September.
be published. Well, it's available in English, but it will be published in Portuguese by Zahar in September. So having said that, we start the Q&A. I ask people to raise very concise questions, because there are many people here who are interested to make questions. So I start with Norman Gall here, and then I will take, let's say, 3-4 questions, and then we go for a second round. So Norman, you just wait, speak on the mic, please.
Thank you. Brazil has very serious problems, but in the United States, you have a president whom you say has dictatorial tendencies, but there arises no meaningful, coherent political opposition to Trump, despite his many vulnerabilities. Can you explain this? A parallel question dealing with Brazil. There is extreme poverty of viable and respected candidates for the presidency. But going beyond that, Brazil has severe institutional problems of political representation, which Brazilians do not talk about. And there is, I would like you to address both questions. Why is the political participation, why does Brazil lack political leadership? And why the United States lacks political leadership from the Democratic Party, which is mainly engaged on sectorial and parochial issues, and not the major issues in which Trump is vulnerable?
Can we take additional questions?
Sure.
Okay, Paula, in the last row.
Hi. Could you comment more on the role of the economy in the scenarios that you've been describing? Because the economic crisis in Brazil is often evoked as a reason for very critical political choices, and some of them unthinkable until 2 or 3 years ago. Thank you very much.
And let me add a footnote. I think you should, the same question but apply it to the United States. How much do you think polarization is due to the growing economic divide? How much it is due to the sort of existential threat felt by white male Americans? Okay, one here.
Hello. I would dare to move the subject to Europe. I wonder if the immigration, legal or illegal, that is happening in Europe, the establishment of no-go zones and other resources, how are they affecting democracies, elections, parties? Thank you.
Last question in this round, over there.
Professor Levitsky, what is wrong with the Democratic Party? I mean, I've been reading Mark Lilla's book, and I want to know your view on this subject.
Oh, I could talk all day about Mark Lilla's book. I had strong opinions about that. I should answer the other questions first.
Go ahead.
All
Thank
right,
you.
He will be here in November.
Oh,
So
yeah?
you came first.
Tell him I said hi.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, let's start with, there were two questions about the opposition to Trump. Let me answer on two levels. First of all, opposition to populism is very difficult because populists do things that are appalling to members of the elite really across the spectrum from left to right that insult and scare businessmen, journalists, academics, really across the spectrum. And we push back, and our pushback tends to reinforce the discourse, the message of the populists that, look, they're all out to get us. And so the media, intellectuals, opposition to a populist, and you see this with Berlusconi in Italy, you saw it with Chavez, you saw it with Fujimori, you saw it with Correa, you see it with Trump. The opposition to a populist often just tends to reinforce animosities on both sides. What's wrong with the Democratic Party? I think the Democratic Party needs to be given a break. First of all, one of the reasons why the United States democracy remains safer than democracy in, say, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Nicaragua, is that the United States continues to possess a robust opposition. The Democratic Party is strong. It's relatively well organized. It's well financed. It has a lot of votes. The problem, quote unquote, with the Democratic Party is it is a very heterogeneous party. It represents a very, very diverse group of Americans. It represents, again, urban secular types like me, and it represents African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and a sector of the white working class. Those are very different people with very different demands, very different needs, very different interests, very different ideologies. So a very heterogeneous party, by necessity, is somewhat incoherent, is somewhat pragmatic, does not possess a clear, cohesive ideology. It never will. It's too diverse for that. The Republican Party is very coherent. It's very ideologically coherent. It's very cohesive because it's an unusually homogeneous force. It's basically all white Christians. That's easy to represent. It's not easy to represent a society as diverse as basically half of America. Now, why isn't the Democratic Party behaving like Mark Lilla wishes that it would? I'm sorry, many of you may not know him. He looks back to the 1930s, looks back at Roosevelt and wishes for a party that represented the working class, which means the white working class. The problem with that is that 44% and rising percent of the Democratic Party vote is non-white. Half the party is non-white. A growing number of its activists are non-white. A growing number of its leaders are non-white. That's inevitable. It's a product of democracy. The party is no longer the white working class party that some people nostalgically wish for. The country has changed because of immigration and because of racial moves towards racial equality. The Democratic Party is representing that change, and that is inevitable. It's challenging. Multiracial democracy is a hard thing to manage, but and it leads to all the things that Mark Lilla wrings his hands about. But it's inevitable. You can tell him that when he gets here. So the severe institutional problems in Brazil. I mean, I think Brazil is experiencing a perfect storm, right, with a severe political crisis at the same time as a severe economic crisis. I mean, what happened a few years ago, having what could fairly be characterized as the worst corruption crisis of any democracy ever, at the same time as a tremendous economic crisis, putting those, I mean, any democracy anywhere would suffer from just one of those crises. You put two of them together, and you have where Brazil is. Brazil's problems of political representation and of the responsiveness of its elected politicians and its Congress, and the perceived gap between voters and politicians is a serious problem. but it's a medium-term problem. It's not a problem that any single reform can fix overnight. It will take a series of reforms, and it will take time. But I would treat it almost like a cancer patient who's suffering from a gunshot wound to the chest, right? Right now, Bolsonaro is the gunshot wound to the chest. That's the crisis that has to be averted first. And then the country's democratic parties. I think I continue to believe that the pillars of Brazilian democracy continue to be the PSDB and the PT, which means they have to learn once again how to talk to one another to begin to resolve the country's institutional problems. But that's an immediate problem. That's post-election. We can't solve all these problems simultaneously. The what? I very much hope that's not the case. What's the role of the economy? This is a very common phenomenon across the world. When countries pass through really difficult economic times, people lose faith naturally in their politicians. They may lose faith in democratic institutions. They may grow frustrated, angry at the elite, often for good reason. And those are the times when populists emerge. Those are the times when demagogues emerge. So those are the moments where Democrats have to be particularly on guard, where Democrats have to be particularly aggressive in defense of democracy. All countries pass through periods of economic crisis that give rise to demagogues. The U.S., the Great Depression, we had a whole slew of demagogues. Left-wing demagogues like Huey Long, right-wing demagogues like Father Coughlin. The key is riding out those storms, is surviving those storms. And that's the task right now. In the United States, I think there's no question. The United States has the highest level of income inequality since before the Great Depression. It's an extraordinary increase in inequality that is a severe problem. I think it has made things worse. I think if we had 1950s or 1960s levels of inequality, the level of resentment and anger among the so-called white working class would be less. But I think that economic concerns are secondary. They reinforce, but haven't caused the polarization. The polarization is about race and culture. A lot of independent businessmen, people who earn middle and upper middle class salaries, strongly support Donald Trump. It's not just poor whites. It is poor whites and many, usually not very well educated, but many wealthy, many whites who are doing quite well under globalization and are doing quite well after the 2008-2009 crisis still voted for Trump. It's not only about the economy. Immigration from Europe, so I don't know European politics very well. I think, look, multiracial democracy is one of the biggest challenges facing Western democracies going forward. It's facing the United States and it's facing Western Europe. It's a big challenge. Immigration is causing a reaction. It's giving rise, obviously, to what we call extreme right political parties. That's not necessarily authoritarianism, though. I don't like right-wing, extreme right parties in Europe ideologically. I disagree with them on just about everything. I find them frightening. I find them distasteful. They're not necessarily a threat to democracy, though. They may, as long as they play by democratic rules, which for the most part they have in Europe, they're not necessarily a threat to democracy. I think European democracies so far have handled, have not shown the kind of institutional crisis and polarization that we see in the United States. That may happen, but it hasn't happened yet. I think I got the...
I think there is a pending question that you've made.
What's wrong with the Democratic Party, right? Or did it...
Outside, all right. So second round, you have one Saleshi there, one there, the other here. And then, all right, you go first and then Salesh.
Okay, two questions for you, and they in part relate to what is happening here in Brazil. One is it better to have two strong parties like in the United States? You have Democrats and the Republicans, whereas here in Brazil you have a lot of parties, multi-parties, and the system is set up so that almost anybody who sets up a new party can get funding, and so you have really a lot of different parties, and so people really can't get together. Second thing here is I think Bolsonaro, the reason he's doing well is the crime here. I think there's a lot of people, especially poor people, who just don't have security, and so I think that's the reaction to it. He's the law and order guy. So I think that's probably what is some of what is happening here.
Good. Salej.
You mentioned a lot of Latin American and South American countries. The question is how the foreign partners like US and others support democracy around the world. Because our experience with such kind of support sometimes is a little bit, let's say, worry about. And
Say more.
yeah.
There are a lot of different opinions about U.S. support for democracy.
The second question is, you mentioned also what happened in Germany. And for sure you know that Professor Dott, who was the last U.S. ambassador to Germany, advised several times, informed us several times what is going on in Germany. And the U.S. business say, don't touch Hitler. IBM helped very much to become what became in the Germany with Holocaust, for instance. So where is the role of the business around the world and democracy?
Good. Last one here, Pastore.
Yes, congratulations for the brilliant talk. Very good. I wonder, under what circumstances the judiciary system becomes involved and seduced by the authoritarian candidates?
Seduced by? What do you mean by that?
Involved by the authoritarian, captured by the authoritarian.
Oh, okay.
Well, last train to Paris. Does any, okay. Well, I'm thinking about the exile. Yeah. If we have any choice.
Professor Levitsky, I think it's very important to consider that the Brazilian crisis is not only economic or political, it's also a crisis of democratic leadership. We are lacking democratic leadership. And I think that in the context of some dimensions of authoritarian culture, political culture in Brazil, the question would be how, in this context, to give conditions to raise new democratic leaderships.
Oof,
Last and easy, the easiest question is Moisés, all right. The last question is the easiest. This is the rule here. Yeah.
That was easy.
All right, the floor is yours.
Those are great questions. I guess I'll go in order. Look, there are strengths and weaknesses to both two-party and multi-party systems, although a pretty good argument can be made against an extreme multi-party system like in Brazil. I think there's no question that democracies have been made to work under two-party systems and multi-party systems. There's not I would never make a sort of hard and fast argument for one over the other. There has been an argument, and Juan Lins is one who's made it, but others have as well, that multi-party systems don't work very well combined with presidentialism, that it's better to combine multi-partyism with a parliamentary system than with a presidential system. It's difficult for presidents to build and to maintain governability in a context of a multi-party system where they never have a majority in Congress. Now, so some very, very smart colleagues of mine in the United States argued, and you will remember this very well, back in the early 1990s that Brazil was ungovernable. It was impossible to govern Brazil because of multi-party presidentialism, because the combination of presidentialism with an extreme multi-party system. Brazilians had an answer to that, which was coalitional presidentialism, presidencialismo de coalição. They showed political science There isn't necessarily a happy ending to the story, but they showed political science that it's possible to kind of parliamentarize presidential systems when presidents build and sustain multi-party coalitions in Congress. Initially, we didn't think that was possible. We didn't think it was likely. Turns out, as the Chileans have shown, as the Brazilians have shown, that it's possible to do. The problem in Brazil is that it was done, particularly in the latter years, via corruption. The parties were glued together not by policies, not by ideology, but by giving each party a handful of the state, a chance to feed off the state. And we ended up with Petrobras and the corruption that you all know very well. And so the challenge in Brazil today with its multi-party system, because I don't think that's going to change in the near future. Brazil is going to continue to have many parties. It's going to continue to have a fragmented party system. The challenge is, how do you make multi-party presidentialism work? How do you make coalitional presidentialism, which is a important, positive, democratic innovation, how do you make that work without corruption? How do you glue parties together in a coalition without letting them feed off the state, without giving them a chunk of Petrobras? And that's one of the big challenges facing Brazilian democracy. Forgive me if I miss any of these questions. Bolsonaro and crime, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been worried ever since the rise of Duterte in Philippines. You know, when is the Latin American Duterte going to appear? Because crime, it varies, and in some countries not quite what it was 5 years ago, but crime in almost every country in Latin America is considered the worst or close to the worst problem. So the question is, when is somebody going to come in who promises an authoritarian solution to crime? And I've actually been surprised that we haven't seen it very much in Latin America. We've seen it relatively little, but I think you're absolutely right about Bolsonaro. Now, the question about U.S. support for democracy, I'm not sure that or Western support for democracy, I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I'll tell you my take, and jump in if I'm misunderstanding your question. The U.S. as a hegemonic power, as a global superpower, has always been involved in regime outcomes in peripheral states in Latin America, in supporting some regimes and in opposing other regimes. My own position is that during the Cold War, the U.S. was a pretty negative force for democracy because its primary goal was fighting communism, not promoting democracy. I also think that the U.S. record after the end of the Cold War, the post-Cold War record, post-Cold War era, Bush padre, Clinton, even Bush hijo, or filho, right? And to some extent Obama, that the U.S. record in promoting democracy in Latin America was better. It was not perfect, but it was better. That the U.S. was by and large a positive force for democracy in Latin America between 1980, and actually between the end of Reagan's presidency and recently. That's changed dramatically in recent years. The U.S. withdrawal began under Obama, but it's much more intense under Trump. Under Trump, we now have a government that not only does not care about democracy, but actually has a little like for autocrats. And you know, one clear example that we've seen recently is Honduras. In Honduras, a conservative government used a PAC Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution and obtain an illegal re-election. That election was questionable, might have been stolen, and the U.S. was very quick to say, "Great, guys, we love it." There's now very little cost, external cost, international cost, to authoritarianism in Latin America. In some sense, we're back to the Cold War era. That's one of the reasons why I think the international climate is less favorable for democracy than it was in the 1990s. What's the role of business? We happen to have sitting next to me one of the leading experts in the world on the role of business and political regimes in Latin America, so I'm very fearful of saying anything. I learned a lot about business and democracy from President Cardoso. Business can work either way. my own view, this is probably a normative view. I'm not sure it's objectively true, but I believe that it is in businesses' long-term interest to defend democratic institutions, and that when business operates in a far-sighted way, it defends democracy. But often, business elites are not far-sighted, particularly during a crisis. They tend to be very short-sighted, and they can make some pretty decisive mistakes. But if you wanted to add anything, you should, because this is not an area that I know much about. What did I write here? The judiciary and authoritarianism. There are some cases where judiciaries flirt with authoritarians before they come to power, but the real issue, in my view, is capturing the judiciary is the first move. It is the first item on the agenda of almost every elected autocrat. If you're an elected autocrat and you want to retain if you plan on abusing power or perpetuating yourself in power, the first thing you need to do is get the referee in your pocket. Capture the judiciary. That does two things. It protects you from investigation. It allows you to abuse power, to break the law and be protected. And it allows you to use the law as a weapon against your opponents, right? Your opponent gets charged with tax violations or corruption, and so almost every elected autocrat that you can identify across the world, the first thing that they do is go after the judiciary, co-opt it, pack it, purge it. Trump has tried; he's been less successful than others. Boy, how do you get democratic leadership? Thanks for that one. That's I don't know. I have been fortunate enough in my brief time here to meet young Brazilians who have founded a number of really impressive creative organizations that are trying to do just that, that are trying to sponsor, that have raised money to help recruit, train, and support new leaders. How do you, is it Renova? Renova. Really interesting organization. And so, we need to give civil society, we need to give entrepreneurs the time and the space to innovate and to come up with reforms. There's no single leader is going to come up with leadership from above. God will not provide this. Brazilians will provide this. And we need to continue to give Brazilians the time and the space to do that. And that's why it's so important to protect democracy.
Presidente, sim, se o senhor quiser fazer
No, just 2 or 3 words. First of all, to say how happy we are in receiving you here. I read your book. I was enthusiastic with your book. I think that we need to read your book because it's true that democracy dies. And we are facing a very difficult moment. I cannot say in depth what I think about because this is on TV. It always is a danger.
Nobody told me it was on TV.
Yeah.
Take it back.
everything here is on the
TV,
record.
and every word has to be very cautious. But anyhow, what you said is, I think, is correct. What happened in America was an enormous polarization, and the reasons for the polarization were clearly explained. I would add only that we have new means of communication, which also helps, very quick diffusion of images, news, fake news, so on and so forth, and the polarization too. If you look what is happening in Brazilian network, is a tremendous polarization. The other day, my son, my daughter was there too, received from some friend, meme, I don't know how to say this in English, but anyhow, in which I was with Lula, and one said to the other, let's do the same, but let these guys, each one of us will implement socialism in Brazil anyhow. Well, I never said that. We're competing at the time. So, but anyhow, this is the extreme right, which wants to put together all the others, and they are all fake. They are all trying to implement what they are not telling you. So be cautious. So this is the situation. There is in Brazil something which is not totally new, but from the Constitution up to today is a new thing, is hate. There is hate among people, not only at the political level, but among Brazilian society. Since I am an old man, I'm not fortunate in telling you, but I am an old man, so I remember other moments of hate in Brazil. Under Vargas, my family was very close to Vargas, to the Varguismo at least, but to Vargas too. Well, at that time, the hate was the day-by-day life, in life. Well, again, when Goulart was in power, again, it was very simple to feel the sense that it would be impossible to have any kind of dialogue. We're not at that point, but we are approaching that point. And this is very dangerous. And the other day, I went to the court, to the judiciary, to give a testimony. I was asked to be there because Lula's people asked me to be there. What about? About the constitution of a Lula Institute. I had no idea. I'm not there. I told about what we did in this institute. Well, very immediately, the reaction was terrible against me. What are you doing there? Are you defending Lula? Well, I'm not defending Lula. I'm saying I'm telling you what is the truth, following my perception. I'm not sure, but no. And that is the situation nowadays in Brazil. So the lack of tolerance is there already, and this is very dangerous. I'm not here to blame or to criticize or to accuse who are the responsibles. We are all responsible for that, and we have to move around. We have to find a way out of this situation. I don't want to repeat what you said, but in general terms, I agree. We have a threat to democracy. Not necessarily this threat will be materialized. I don't know. It depends. But anyhow, at one point in time, it will be necessary to go back again to a moment of dialogue. Otherwise, it's impossible to go ahead with the nation. We have to take into account that we have a nation. What is that? Maybe it's not the state, not only the establishments, more than that. It's people, but people in one nation, which you repeat again about norms. We have culture too, Brazilian culture. You said that it's very difficult to keep democracy, at least multi-party system, when the racial question is behind. Well, to some extent, we have here a racial question, but not an extreme question in here. Usually, those who have described Brazilian history said that, well, the bad thing in Brazil is the fact that you have always reached an agreement. And this has been blamed, the elite is capable to transform everything into conciliation, as if conciliation would be evil. Democracy requires some degrees of conciliation. Conciliation is not in the sense that I have no one. My idea is the same of yours. No, but to what extent we can live together, in spite of our differences, and that's the party life too. We are approaching a moment of intolerance, and I think that the risk exists in Brazil. It's not imminent, but it exists. It will depend to a large extent on the capacity of the leadership to play a more active role in defending values and have the courage to speak with the enemy, with the other side, to speak with the other side. It's not simple. I don't want to go into details, not in the case. I tried several times. It's difficult because you have no support in your own side. And the other side normally is also very scared. Should I go or not? Better not to move. Now we are approaching elections. Well, I'm realistic. During electoral campaigns, it's impossible to ask people for cohesion. Later on, we will need to think in terms of what kind of cohesion, what type of of institutions, and what type of norms, what type of culture will be capable to sustain the normal exercise of democracy. So I think that to read your book is very important for Brazilians, because it puts very clearly what are the risks and the new forms how democracies die. It's no more because of a coup d'etat in the classical sense. It's another thing, much more difficult to perceive and to fight against. It's a kind of corruption of the values of democracy. It is goes step by step. In our case, has been said several times here, we have an economic crisis, a political crisis, a moral crisis because of corruption. So it's simply difficult. And altogether, this is putting into a very hard situation the political system in Brazil. We have some time to rearrange the whole thing. Otherwise, the threat will be a reality. We are 210 million people. It's a lot of people. So it's impossible to see this dismantling. We have to try to recover and to recreate confidence. Very simple to say, very difficult to realize. And what is fundamental in this kind of situation is the verb. We have to address to the nation. Our leaders are not being capable to speak to the nation what's going on. Some of them are capable to manipulate the Congress, articulate, to be more mild, to articulate the Congress, but not to express to the nation what are our goals, to what extent are we marching toward the goals, what are the instruments, what can be done. So we have to back again to the old times when it was possible to speak to the nation and maybe to try to have a dialogue at that level. Finally, because of the electoral situation in Brazil, we will see in several occasions debates, mainly debates between newspapermen and the candidates. It's dramatic because the debate is an instrument for the destruction of the candidates. Everyone. Destruction. It's not to try to see what are they proposing. Is it possible to do what you are proposing? No. Let's prove that this guy is a fake guy. He's not saying the truth. In the year, I don't know what, you said that and now you are saying that, as if the reality was not moving. So even the electoral debate will probably produce more antagonism instead of more possible cohesion, because we are not discussing the main Brazilian issues. But I'm always more optimistic, and you refer to several of our old friends. Lins was a fantastic guy who really devoted his life into describing, first of all, democracy, and inside democracy, parliamentary rule. He came several times. We have a normal discussion because of that. You see, he said, our friend Guilherme O'Donnell, who worked here with us in Brazil, and Philip Schmidt, these are giants, because decades ago, they, in their efforts, in their books, they asked us to reflect about what you are now reflecting. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.